Imagine this if you can. You have a friend who dies, an unmarried friend with no kids or close relatives, and a person with whom you've had no prior conversation about death. And you find yourself surprised to be charged with making funeral arrangements for your friend because you were named executor in your friend's will, and really there's no one else around but you to make these decisions. Now, there are no pressing money concerns. Your friend was a lifelong faithful Catholic and active in the parish. He was an ardent environmentalist and a bit of a rebel, not over the top, but he always wanted to know why a rule was a rule before he would buy in. Now you're getting all sorts of advice about what to do right now with your friend's body and what the final arrangements ought to be. So, what do you do? Is it to be burial or cremation? What do you think? What are the issues? Is there theology involved, or is this merely a matter of personal preference? Well, let's talk about this, and by the end of this video, I hope to come to a conclusion about what to do with your friend's body. Stay tuned. If we haven't met, my name is Deacon Richard Hudzik, and I use this YouTube channel to hand on the faith, thus the name of the channel. Now let me offer some typically offered reasons for cremation in the Catholic milieu. I just recite them. I don't know that they're all equally convincing or pertinent, but this is some of what you usually hear in terms of in favor of cremation. It's cheaper. And there's, I will note, a cremation trade group online that argues it is only the grasping greed of church and funeral homes that wants to keep people away from cremation. I think that's a stretch. I don't think that's accurate, but it's there. It's said by some. Cremation can be a practical response. For instance, I was at a funeral of a deacon a week or so ago who wanted to be buried with his family in Puerto Rico. Well, shipping the cremated remains is going to be far cheaper than navigating sending a casket through air freight. Now, this is especially going to be the case if you're going to somewhere beyond the boundaries of the United States and crossing international boundaries. I can't imagine the red tape involved in that, in moving a casket. With cremation, you would say that less land is taken up, and rather than burying a large casket, you are placing an urn in the ground or in a mausoleum at the Catholic cemetery. In the Catholic practice, the ashes, the cremated remains, will be placed in an urn and never scattered over the water or dumped from an airplane or kept on the mantelpiece of somebody's home. It's never split up or turned into jewelry or hung on to as a keepsake. Some think of cremation as being somehow a kinder and gentler way of disposing of the body. But if you look at how cremation works, I don't know that that's particularly an apt way of thinking about it. There's this intense fire, about 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit, and it burns for up to 2 hours, depending on how corpulent the person was. And then the end of the process is to pulverize the bones that are remaining in the cremation chamber, and they're ground into small 1/8 inch pieces. Kinder and gentler? I don't know. You could say that with cremation, fewer resources are required. There's no permanent casket and the concrete vault into which the casket is placed if it's buried in the ground. But I do note that if the urn is placed in the ground, you do still need a concrete vault, although it's going to be a little bit smaller. Cremation, affirmatively, seems to speak to that familiar phrase we know from our Ash Wednesday's celebration, taken from the book of Genesis. The cremated remains at least partially act out the phrase, "Remember you are dust, and to dust you shall return." Living scripturally, that's a value. Or finally, Cremation might simply be the preference of the person who has died. And it's a preference that maybe isn't well articulated, but only felt emotionally. But here in our hypothetical, you don't know what your friend wanted. You never talked about death or burial, cremation. He never told you his preferences. So, with these practical points in favor of cremation, why is there any controversy? Is controversy too strong a word? And why is cremation something slightly new to the Catholic mind? Well, it is the case that the acceptance of cremation in the Church is a modern development from the 1960s. From the earliest days until the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, the norm was to inter, to bury bodies. But in a secular effort to reclaim Europe's classical Roman heritage, cremation re-emerged. Moreover, there was a thread of it being a reaction against Christian theology, a modern secular move toward cremation was a rejection of the resurrection of the body, as well as the resurrection of Jesus. And to burn the body was a rejection of the honoring of the body. Thus, for some, cremation became a stance against the Church and was seen as a blow in favor of a modern way of doing things. Although you do have to note the paradox here, in that on the one hand, the cremation revolution was a desire to emulate classical Greek and Roman antiquity, and that doesn't seem terribly modern to me. But in time, in the Catholic Church, as I noted in 1963, the previously existing strong stance against cremation was modified to provide that cremation is seen as consistent with our respect for the body, provided that cremation was not chosen as some testimony against the faith. Well, here's what canon law says today. Section 1176 says, "The Church earnestly recommends that the pious custom of burying the dead be observed. It does not, however, forbid cremation unless it has been chosen for reasons that are contrary to Christian teaching." So, if your friend were to have voiced the idea and said, "Go ahead and cremate me, it will be one final act of defiance on my part, one final blow against the belief in the resurrection," well, in that case, that's not what the Church would envision as a legitimate desire for cremation. So, all things considered, bottom line, cremation is indeed in play for your friend, subject to a few parameters. And this cremation can come after the traditional visitation and wake with the body being present and a funeral mass with the body. After all of that, then cremation occurs. Or cremation can happen right away before the final observances are begun, and then the wake and the funeral and cemetery service would be with only the cremated remains. I do note that the Church's guidance here is to do the cremation only after the funeral. But what about, on the other hand, the traditional method of burial, the visitation, wake, funeral mass, funeral liturgy, trip to the cemetery, and prayers at the place of interment, where the casket with the body is lowered into the ground or placed into a crypt? What argues in favor of that, in favor of burial? Well, here are some points to consider. Submit that burial expresses a reverence for the body. The body is kept intact. Having a burial allows there to be a place of memory. It's a place where the family can come back to. It can serve as a reference point for our memories. And of course, yes, the same can be said of placing the cremated remains in a cemetery. But if you go with me, it strikes me that the physically larger casket is a more intense sign. The mind also does not forget, in the presence of a buried body, that there is a body present, or that there is a body buried. In the earliest days of Christianity, in the days of martyrdom at the hands of the Romans, the remains of the martyrs would typically be scattered, not only to say to the Christian God, fix this if you can, fix this for the resurrection, but scattering the body or the ashes would also prevent their arising a place of veneration. Now, having this place of veneration seems to me to be important. Our memories are so frail. Yeah, and I think of the bones buried in St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. In one of the tombs, there is what we think are the bones of St. Peter. We believe it's the tomb of St. Peter. Well, if we can't keep track even of St. Peter's tomb, I mean, he's rather a monumental figure in the history of our church. Think of what else is lost because of our failure to record or to be intentional about the bodies of our beloved. This is part of the reason for not keeping the ashes at home. You know how we are. There's so much stuff around, and sooner or later, stuff gets misplaced. And when the keeper of the ashes dies, the faithful son or daughter, the kids are not connected to the ashes of grandma or grandpa, maybe the way his kids were. And having the body at the funeral liturgy and the liturgies before the funeral, the visitation, the gathering in the presence of the body, that seems to unmistakably offer a depth to the community's experience of asking God's blessing on the deceased and on those who loved him. And part of our scripture and tradition is to recollect the ascension of Jesus and the assumption of Mary, both bodily transfers into another realm. Those bodies of Jesus and Mary were honored, treasured, lifted up. We, in our humanness, can share in that same dignity. So then, your friend, the deceased lover of ecology, the one who loved to know the reason why, the one you want to honor for days to come and hope that others are edified by his life. What are you going to do with his body? Is it cremation, or is it bodily interment, burial? It seems to be the case that both are open, although the church does express a preference for the traditional burial. So then, since your friend never told you otherwise, I guess you get your friend buried. It will be a place where those who want to remember him can go and pray and be silent. His place of burial will be one more Christian witness in a cemetery to testify to the ages to come, a testimony that says, here are the bones, the flesh of a Christian who is awaiting the resurrection promised to us all. I would argue that the interment, as it is physically a larger something than an urn containing cremated remains, provides a deeper and more intense sign of that promise waiting to be fulfilled. Now, a postscript, please. This brief video is intended only as a way of talking about the church's teaching on cremation and burial in very broad strokes. It is not intended to be comprehensive, and certainly it is not intended to second guess or subject to any scrutiny the decisions others have made for themselves or their loved ones. Indeed, what is hope that comes through is the desire of the church to honor those whom we love. It is to lift up as deeply significant the lives that we lead and the bodies that comprise an essential part of who we are. Perhaps for you that means cremation. For others, it means burial. Thank you for staying to the end. I look forward to being with you in the next video, and may God bless you.